Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rachel Robinson, and I'm the interim dean of the School of International Service. And it's so nice to see you. So, this is the second annual event in partnership with the George C. Marshall Foundation. And our goal for this series is to explore the history and lasting impact of the Marshall Plan. So thank you to Dr. Paul Levengood, President of the Marshall Foundation, for collaborating with us on this, and welcome to board member David Rohl for being here as well, right here in the front row. So before introducing our guest speakers, I am delighted to introduce SIS Professor Gregory Aftandilian, who will moderate today's event. Greg is an expert on Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C., and has authored several monographs and books on Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy, as well as numerous journal articles. Greg worked in government for more than 20 years, including as a Middle East analyst in the Department of Defense and State. And I'll just add a note that is a wonderful example of a practitioner who has come to be a faculty member here at SIS. Now I'll just give a brief intro to our guest speakers. Their full bios are on the invitation, and I'll just say a little bit about each of them. Olga Kakova is the Deputy Director for European Energy Security at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. She leads the Energy Center's portfolio on synchronizing climate and energy security efforts through transatlantic cooperation. And Olga appears frequently on and has been published in numerous media outlets. Ben Steele, sitting over at the end, is Senior Fellow and Director of International Economics at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He is the lead writer of the Council's Geographics Economics blog and the creator of 9 web-based interactives tracking global monetary policy, global inflation, global imbalances, global growth, global trade, global energy, sovereign risk, China's Belt and Road, and central bank currency swaps, which is an impressive list of topics. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today, and I'll now pass over to Paul to say a few words.
Thank you. I'm not even going to go to the microphone because I'm not going to talk that long. I did want to say thank you so much to our partners here at SIS. Rachel, thank you. Allison, Alice, somewhere in the back. They're great to work with. This is really an important program for us, and you're an important audience for us because our mission is to make sure that George Marshall's name and story are told. And in some ways, people who are studying international affairs and thinking about going into jobs or potentially already in jobs in this field should know more about George Marshall. We hear about Marshall Plan as a sort of a short, right, for big, hairy problems in the economy. And you've heard much recently about Marshall Plans and the need for something like a Marshall Plan in post-conflict Ukraine, Gaza, wherever that may be. So we thought it was really important as one of Marshall's greatest legacies that people in a group like you are able to learn a little bit more about what Marshall Plan actually was, whether those calls are. I'm really delighted to have this panel. Ben has worked with us before at the Marshall Foundation. Olga is very sharp. You'll really enjoy your time. Greg, thank you so much for agreeing to do this again. And I turn it over to the panel.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Rachel, for the introductory remarks. And I also want to acknowledge Allison and Alice from the Dean's Office who helped to put this together, as well as the George C. Marshall Foundation and all of your support. This is our second in a series, hopefully of many more. And we're delighted to have this collaboration with the George C. Marshall Foundation. Today, we're very fortunate to have, as Rachel mentioned, 2 very distinguished speakers, Ben and Olga. We're obviously going to talk about the history of the Marshall Plan and the economics behind it, but we're also going to have a discussion about its applicability or not vis-a-vis the Ukraine issue, whether we don't know, of course, when the Ukraine war is going to end, but if it does, this could be an interesting issue to tackle. I'm sure because of all the news, some people in the audience may also want to raise an issue about the Gaza situation, post conflict situation there, and whether the Marshall Plan could be applicable to that situation as well. So without further ado, let me pass the baton over to Ben, who is a distinguished economist, and he's written a very interesting book that was published a few years ago on the Marshall Plan. So we're delighted to have him here. Thank you, Ben.
Great. Thank you, Rachel and Paul, for having me on with you all. As Paul. How's that? Better? Oh, sorry. So both Paul and Greg mentioned Ukraine is hardly the only place in the world where there have been recent calls for a Marshall Plan. There have been calls in Gaza, not surprisingly, Syria, virtually every country in Africa. The only common denominator I've noticed behind all these calls is the idea that if you just spend enough money, you can transform any war zone into a thriving, prosperous, cosmopolitan, liberal democracy. And unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. So I thought it would be useful to start the discussion with an overview of the old original Marshall Plan, which has never been replicated anywhere in the world. And hopefully that will help you understand how unique the circumstances were, how it was necessary to make corrections along the way, and why money is not the only thing you need to make these sorts of transformations. So a little background on the Marshall Plan. The ideas that ultimately became the Marshall Plan started percolating, interestingly enough, throughout the military establishment in the United States in 1945 and 1946. And why was that? Well, they were very conscious of the fact that we were coming to the end of the war, and President Roosevelt had, in fact, stated publicly at the Tehran Allied War Leaders Conference in Tehran in 1943 that he intended to withdraw all American troops from Europe within 2 years of the end of the fighting. President Truman, of course, who succeeded him in April of 1945, had absolutely no intention of backtracking from that. It was widely understood that the American public would not tolerate a long and costly occupation in Europe. So quite naturally, there was concern, particularly in the military establishment, about how law and order was going to be reestablished in Europe. There was obviously concern about the Soviet Union and what their intentions were in terms of spreading their ideology and forms of government throughout Europe. But there were also concerns about countries embracing different forms of fascism again. In fact, the United States was at one point, fast forward to 1947, almost as concerned about the return to power of the Gaullists in France as they were about the possible coming to power of the French communists. So the idea was that the United States was really at a unique point in history. It's at the apex of its power, militarily, politically, economically. It has the opportunity to experiment in some rather unique forms of aggressive diplomacy that it might not be able to do had it not been for this dominance. Remember, at the time, the United States has sole possession of nuclear weapons, for example. So it's not significantly threatened by any power in the world at this point. And the idea was that the United States could leverage its economic power. At this point, it accounts for about half the world's GDP, to quickly rebuild the productive apparatus in Europe so that countries could provide for their own security and that they wouldn't have to depend on the United States. military spending in the United States plummeted between 1945 and 1948. We were spending $963 billion on defense in 1945. By 1948, that plummets to 95 billion. So we're not in a position to support a long, deep occupation in Europe. So let's talk a bit about the money up front, just so then we can move on to the more important things. What kind of money was ultimately put behind the Marshall Plan? Well over 4 years, roughly from 1948 to 1952, the United States allocated $13.2 billion to reconstruction aid in Western Europe. We'll talk about why it was confined to mainly Western Europe. That's equivalent in today's money to about $180 billion. But as a percentage of US GDP over that period, we're talking about over $1 trillion. So this was a very significant commitment on the part of the United States. Having said that, economists have run econometric exercises on this money to try to determine how much of the remarkable revival of economic output in the recipient countries could be ascribed to the money itself. And what they found is it was significant, but certainly less than 1 percentage point worth, only a fraction of the actual revival, which was typically 6-7% GDP growth per year, 60% increase in output over this period. So really remarkable. So it wasn't the money itself. The money was an important pump primer, but it's not the money on its own that did it. And there are 3 factors that I would highlight as being absolutely essential. The first one went hand in hand with the money, which is the complete reversal of US occupation policy in Germany between 1945 and 1947. In 1945, the United States under President Roosevelt, this actually goes back to late 44, was pursuing the so-called Morgenthau Plan for deindustrializing Germany. The idea is if we ripped up all Germany's productive apparatus and transferred it to the Soviet Union and to France and the other allied nations, Germany would never threaten its neighbors again. The thing is that Germany had never been self-sufficient agriculturally, and Treasury Secretary Morgenthau was warned that this would lead to mass starvation and chaos in Germany, and that the only beneficiaries would be the Soviets, but he was quite insistent that this was the way to go. By 1947, it was clear that this was absolutely the wrong way to go. Germany was sinking into anarchy. There was near starvation in certain regions of the country, and this seemed to be redounding to Stalin's benefit. Obviously, he was looking to take over the entirety of the country. And as the most important component of the Marshall Plan, that policy was reversed entirely. The quickest way to reconstruct the productive apparatus in Europe was to revive German industry, which was the industrial heart of Europe. But the only way you could possibly do that at the time was basically to bribe France and Britain, that they were not going to participate in American ideas of integrating Western Europe. So these ideas of effectively a European Union came from the State Department. The French in particular were staunchly against it. The only way the French and the British would accept this is if the United States not only provided them with funds, but provided them with ironclad security guarantees. Okay, so that's the second factor that I want to emphasize here. So they weren't just concerned with with Soviet expansionism. They were concerned with what Germany would become if it was revived industrially again. And so the United States had to guarantee their security. So a year and a day after the Marshall Aid legislation was passed, that's in April of 1948, you get the North Atlantic Treaty creating NATO. NATO essentially became the military escort of Marshall Aid. Now, if you go back to my comments at the beginning, what was the American military establishment looking to do? Disengage from Europe. In other words, give them money, let them reconstruct their productive apparatus and take care of themselves. The Europeans told the United States, we cannot do that, particularly if you demand that we integrate our economies, because we will no longer be self-sufficient. We will be dependent on German production, German coal, German steel. This is a dangerous situation for us. So the security guarantees became very significant. The third factor I want to emphasize, and this is an extremely important one, when General Marshall, in his speech at Harvard in June 1947, made what became the Marshall Plan. He never referred to it, of course, as the Marshall Plan. He made American funding available to all European countries. Now, the Americans were not naive. They knew that the Soviets would not be constructive participants, and they had plans to make sure that Stalin would ultimately reject this offer, which he did. But the Czechs and the Poles embraced it a little too enthusiastically for Stalin's taste. And he began immediately cracking down on all the so-called coalition governments in Central and Eastern Europe to make sure that they could not participate in the plan. This led to a big debate in the State Department. What did they do for Czechoslovakia in particular, which was a democracy? They had relatively free and fair elections in 1946 in which a coalition government was elected. It had a small d Democratic president, a capital C communist prime minister, but 2/3 of the cabinet were in fact Democrats. And the United States wanted to support them. But General Marshall in particular, supported by George Kennan, who actually accurately predicted that there would be a communist coup supported by the Soviets in early 1948, that's exactly what happened, decided that the Americans did not have the troops necessary to defend Czechoslovakia, and we weren't going to go to nuclear conflict with the Soviet Union over Czechoslovakia. We might have been willing to do it over Berlin, but we were not willing to do it over Czechoslovakia. So that Iron Curtain that Churchill refers to in 1946, well, George Marshall played some role in drawing it. He said, well, everything to the left of this line, we think we're capable of defending. So this is a good investment for us. Everything to the right of that line, we're not capable of defending. So we're very sorry. We hope we meet you on the other side of history, that eventually you'll be liberated and can join us, but we understand right now that you cannot. And if we had taken a different perspective in the 1940s and insisted that the Poles and the Czechs be part of the Marshall Plan, we would not be talking about success today. We would be talking about failure, because we would have gone to war with the Soviet Union. And the main aim of the Marshall Plan was to allow these countries who are participating to secure their own interests without being totally dependent on us, without us having to go to war with the Soviet Union. So the exclusion of Czechoslovakia and Poland were integral to the reason that we consider the Marshall Plan to be a success today. So that brings me to the subject of our conversation today, Ukraine. What position is Ukraine in? Well, unfortunately, it's in a very similar position to Czechoslovakia in 1948, when Stalin instigated a communist coup in the country to ensure that it could never be independent. Ukraine, unfortunately, shares 1,200 miles of land border with Russia. And it is literally impossible to conceive of a massive reconstruction occurring in Ukraine without at least the tacit cooperation of the Russians. That doesn't necessarily mean a peace agreement, but it does mean some sort of armistice where Russia can give clear and firm and open commitments not to interfere with the reconstruction of Ukraine. My personal belief is that that probably will be impossible for as long as Vladimir Putin remains in power in Russia, but we have to deal with the practicalities of that matter.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ben. Now I'd like to turn things over to Olga. Thank you.
Can you hear me okay? Well, thank you all for joining us. I know it's a Monday afternoon, and I'm sure you have a lot of different options and a lot of things, a lot of events going on. So great to see all of this interest. Thank you so much for the background and the context. I mean, as I was listening to your remarks, I was kind of internally thinking about how certain things in history, in the way Russia behaves, and certain things in terms of conflicts and the amount of suffering and the scale of it, how unfortunately history tends to repeat itself. And we, in some ways, keep making the same mistakes over and over again, but we also have this ability now to build a much different future because we have much different tools, and we live in a world where things can move much faster, not just information, but big initiatives and big audacious ideas. So for Ukraine, I think you're right. I think it's important to start in a place, in a realistic place, because I think these discussions that start off as, all right, well, how do we start rebuilding Ukraine? And, you know, if you check Ukraine's map, and if you check every morning kind of to see how many cities, how many people have died, this is the reality on the ground. You know, universities, some of the best universities in Europe, teaching some of the, you know, the brightest minds in Europe, some of the most talented students are underground, or the students are learning from home, or they're learning in basements, or they're just simply not going to school anymore, or if they have left Ukraine. So this is just the everyday reality. So for us to kind of say, let's jump into the future and see and pretend like it is hard. It is hard to have that discussion. But I would challenge us that there's a few things that we can start thinking about right now in terms of setting up Ukraine in Europe, in the United States, and any allies out there for success, and understanding what the new version of the Marshall Plan could look like. Because you're right, I don't think it's going to be something that was in exact the same structure. There isn't the same level of money available, not that it was available or ready to go. It was still a fight back then. Any kind of funding, any kind of support is going to be a tough conversation in today's economy, right? From United States, from Europe. But I think we have some exciting opportunities when it comes to Ukraine, even now, even in the midst of the conflict. And I think we have to start with now, because otherwise, if we keep jumping into a future that doesn't quite yet exist, that's really challenging, and it's not helpful. So what is the situation right now? Currently, U.S. is not providing any financial support for Ukraine. So this is the reality. So when we talk about a big, exciting, audacious plan for reconstruction in Ukraine, this is where we are right now as United States. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will stay here, that this wouldn't change, that there wouldn't be some changes, some creative solutions and shifts in the government and the position, but this is the current situation now. Now, what has that done to European aid for Ukraine? Europe has continued its generosity and its aid, but now also a lot of it has to go towards some of the social support across Ukraine, just so that Ukraine can literally pay the remaining people who are brave and who chose to stay, risk their lives to work for the government, making, you know, very non-competitive salaries, to be frank, risking their lives, but just to keep the country running, to not leave their homes, to keep on with their lives. That's, you know, these people are now working off a very short, limited budget from the Ukrainian government, from the outside support. So when we think about what does the new Marshall Plan for Ukraine look like, it is going to be, if I could summarize it into a couple of sentences, it is going to be about taking a little bit of public money that's available, that will continue to be available, and then finding ways to multiply it through private sector engagement, through private sector cooperation, through figuring out how Ukraine can get launch itself. It's already doing these things in the midst of the war, can launch itself to self-dependency so that you don't constantly have a deficit where you're relying on Europe, on the United States, on other neighbors and governments for your country's future. So, and Ukraine has a lot to offer, but we have to be realistic again. I was in Rome for the Ukraine Recovery Conference, and it was really inspiring to see, did all of the tools and necessary mechanisms get unveiled to solve the risk factors in investing in Ukraine? Absolutely not. But there was tremendous progress done on additional tools, additional risk insurance. So if you're a company investing in Ukraine, you have options. I'm not saying they're sufficient, especially for the scale of investments that need to take place. But for the first time, some venture capital is going into Ukraine. There is a Invest Ukraine tool online that you can go to see what projects are bankable, ready to go, available. There are a number of countries that provide bilateral assurances and insurances. So for example, let's take Italy because they hosted. They have a number of tools for their own companies. If they want to go and invest in Ukraine, start, some kind of a factory or project, there are of course limitations to how much these tools will cover. If you want to ship their products, a lot of actually these insurance mechanisms cover, and this is where, the limitations are, they'll cover their products, their movements, when they get to Ukraine. But after that, where we really see a shortage is more of the long-term protection of different projects. However, that hasn't stopped Ukraine. We're seeing a lot of diversified energy installations being built out across Ukraine. So this is another subtext to what does a big, audacious new Marshall Plan for Ukraine would look like. Well, it will depend a lot on decentralized leadership. Ukraine is a democratic, innovative country, and a lot of these kind of micro grids, if you would, micro communities are being kind of built out now as a response to keep the lights on as the infrastructure is being destroyed. But at the same time, it will be this balance of decentralized, locally led, but integrated and also connected to a centralized system. Ukraine's energy system operator is called Ukrenergo. And it's really important to balance those two things. So when we think about a big, audacious plan and we say, what does that look like? So it is going to be a more interconnected country. It will be energy installations that are harder to hit with bombs and other exciting things that Russia continues to send to Ukraine every day. It will be a more digitalized system that talks and interacts with consumers in response to consumer needs. It will be hopefully more efficient, an opportunity for a more efficient system using solutions and hopefully in the future AI to adapt and be smart and reduce waste in how we use energy, how we transmit energy across the grid. And then the final output and the quality of life is what we're really going after. When we think about energy use, we want a high quality of life, and so do Ukrainian people. So that's kind of the future. So that's an initial kind of overview. I'm happy to dive into kind of any specific technologies or sectors with the most opportunities, but I think it gives you an interesting kind of overview of where we see in the Marshall Plan, what is the situation today, and how should we be thinking about it now?
Thank you very much, Olga, for those very insightful comments. I'm going to play the role of having the audacity to ask questions first, and then we'll open up to the audience. But for Ben, I'd like to talk a little bit about your sort of comment that, of course, Stalin had the veto power over the East European countries in the 40s. And you referenced this idea of Putin maybe having some veto power in the present situation. So if you could elaborate on that. And then for Olga, my question would be, obviously we've seen increased defense spending in Europe, in part because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also because of Trump's pressure in recent months. Can some of that increased defense spending be shifted, in your view, towards economic reconstruction in Ukraine? Or are we talking about just two, like apples and oranges? For Ben, please.
in terms of the parallels with the 40s, I think they're almost perfect. That in the case of the 16 Marshall countries, they didn't share borders with the Soviet Union. It was much more difficult for the Soviets to subvert or invade. With regard to Ukraine, unfortunately, however the conflict ends, it's going to involve some degree of continued Russian, we'll call it what it is, occupation. Almost certainly Crimea, I would say certainly Crimea, and much of eastern Ukraine. I don't anticipate that this will be a peace treaty. It would only be an armistice of sorts, as we have right now in Korea, which, as you know, has always been an exceptionally delicate situation. We're talking the same in Ukraine. So Olga talked, for example, about ensuring new projects in Ukraine, for example, in the energy sector. If I were Vladimir Putin, I would be keeping good tracks of what projects are insured, and I would be making sure that my missiles could hit them. Or if they were in eastern Ukraine, it's even easier because it's right on my border. I can easily infiltrate the areas with little green men who can subvert them. But what I would be trying to do is to make sure that I communicate that Western investment in Ukraine will never be profitable without Russian interest being met. Now, do I like saying something like this? No, but we have to be realistic about geography. We can't change it. So we have to try to work around it.
Just a follow-up. There was some remarks several months ago about maybe a couple of EU countries having a small military force in Ukraine post-conflict. Do you see that also as having a Russian veto? I know Putin did not like that idea, but can the West prevail just as a tripwire force, as a protector? Thanks.
I think as long as the force were declared openly not to be under NATO auspices, that it might be acceptable to the Russians under certain parameters. I don't think that force in any case will be substantial enough to deter the Russians if they feel that their fundamental interests are being compromised in Ukraine's development.
If you could answer the question I posed to you, thank you.
Yeah, can I just quickly respond to that? I mean, I don't think there is a secure future in Europe. This is not even about Ukraine if Putin is still in charge. Europe is literally under attack already. This is not just Ukraine. European cables are being dragged, disrupted. Some of those cables take months, not days, not weeks, months to fix because the parts are so scarce, because they didn't anticipate that Russian or Chinese or other ships would be doing this. The grid system is under threat already from both kinetic and cybersecurity attacks. And European airspace has been tested, let's just use that word, from different directions. So defeating Putin is not, a Ukrainian pipe dream. It is a #1 threat to European security and transatlantic energy security, because just because there's an ocean between us now, that does not, our systems are constantly under attack. Today, in Washington, D.C., there are a number, it doesn't matter, pick any city, pick any organization, any company. We're already under attack through cybersecurity attacks and other sabotage from Russia. So to think that we can have any kinds of agreements, expectations, any kinds of logical, okay, if we were to do this, then Putin will definitely do that. This is a man who lost billions and billions of dollars of his own budget, 155 just from some of the oil sales, since the start of the full-scale invasion in 2022. This is the man who literally spent, the country spent decades building out interconnections into Europe, decades, and tremendous amounts of money. Today, Europe signed off an enforceable plan. It's a legal plan. It's not just a big dream or a big target. It started off as a target, but now Europe is banning Russian LNG and Russian pipe gas, which if you were to say that even 4 years ago, you would have laughed. I would have actually laughed. I would have said, okay, well, I'd love to see that, but I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's possible. Much of that has happened because Putin stopped sending the energy gas to Europe, and then Europe woke up and actually said, all right, we can do, it's going to be expensive, it's going to be challenging, but we can do it without it. So this is not a man, this is not a country under this leadership. It doesn't matter if there are Russian assets, it doesn't matter. There is no logic to his cruelty. And this is a really important part. Because if there was any type of logic, if there was any type of care for what's good for Russian people, what's good for the Russian economy, Russia today wouldn't be in the condition that it is. This war has caused tremendous suffering to Ukrainian people, but Russian people are not better off. And they will be suffering consequences of this for decades to come. So this is not a man who cares about deals or what's fair. Anything he says, anything he has committed to, we have seen over and over again. He goes back on that word. So I do not foresee any kind of circumstances, any kind of future where you could have any kind of agreements with Vladimir Putin, because every single previous agreement he has signed on to has been a joke. And he chose this insane chase of Soviet Union expansion versus anything logical, anything that would have contributed to Russian economy and Russian prosperity. Russia today would be selling so much more gas to Europe through LNG as well, and our gas industry would look very, very different today. If he did not invade Ukraine, they actually would have generated probably double the profits had they not invaded Ukraine. This is not a man who's driven by any kinds of logical agreements. He's driven by anger and other emotions. Now, on the question of, what did you want me to cover again?
Well, as I said, the European countries have boosted defense spending. And I'm just curious whether, if there is a post-conflict Ukraine, could some of those funds be shifted to reconstruction, or are we just talking apples and oranges?
Unfortunately, we are. And I wish we had the luxury to sit back and say, oh, what would be the best way? I think right now, when you talk to the Ukrainian government, they're saying victory is the number one thing, because there is no society, there is no post-conflict if Ukraine doesn't win. So there is this tremendous pressure of how much, ideally, I think the president would like to see 100 billion dedicated, if we can get some of that money moved from, if this mechanism works out, that's been developed in Europe by G7, to take some of Russia's frozen assets and take the revenue off of those assets, and then take some of those assets. And it will take decades for this to actually move through like an actual physical money. But you could do this now, where you can provide additional support for Ukraine, anywhere from 60 billion a year or so, and split it up in a couple of years. So then you have some influx coming in. It's not finalized. We could see it finalized in April, which means hopefully then money would be coming through towards the end of the year. Unfortunately, we're not in a luxurious place to say that we, slice and dice. You need, the way Ukrainian budget works, you need about 50, 60 billion for just basic societal, again, just salaries, so that people can just survive and the country can keep running. The democratic country of Ukraine can keep existing, and the continued reforms that we talked about, integration with the European Union, adopting laws and regulations that would put Ukraine on par. In many ways, Ukraine has already done that, but integrating even closer in terms of its governance, its systems, its transparency, that costs money, and that costs extra money when you're in the midst of the war, when you're trying to reform your country while also defending it and just trying to survive. So unfortunately, we're not quite there yet. Ukraine really just needs a lot more weapons to survive.
Go ahead then.
You're not going to be surprised that I disagree with Olga on Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is a very logical man. He's not always making decisions on an informed basis. He's obviously surrounded by sycophants who give him a misleading impression, for example, of Ukrainian sense of nationality. Having said that, everything you could accuse him of in terms of his neglect of the Russian people, you can multiply that by 10, 20, 30, and apply it to Joseph Stalin. And what did the United States decide to do in the case of dealing with Joseph Stalin? Give him a buffer zone. Give him a buffer zone. What did George Kennan say? One of the architects of the Marshall Plan in the late 1990s, when he was nearly 100 years old, he said, do not expand NATO into Central and Eastern Europe because it is going to produce a new nationalist backlash in Russia and would ultimately lead to renewed conflict between the United States and Russia. Now, the natural response I always hear to that is that this is ridiculous because NATO was never a threat to Russia. NATO was never going to invade Russia. That was never the issue. Never the issue. When a country joins NATO, it changes its behavior towards Russia dramatically because of Article 5, which is the mutual security guarantees. So just to give you one example, Turkey in 2015 shot down a Russian fighter that strayed inadvertently over its territory from Syria. It shot down that fighter plane. And what did the Turkish Foreign Ministry immediately say publicly to make sure the Russians heard? Turkish airspace is NATO airspace, meaning if you try to retaliate, you're going to war with the United States. And this is a problem for the United States, because how many Americans do you think even know that Lithuania is under our protection, that they have Article 5 security guarantees? They don't know it. If they did know it, they wouldn't like it, and they would want out of it. So this is a problem that we have to deal with. The fact that Vladimir Putin is a bad man does not mean that we can just turn our eyes away and ignore it. My personal view is that the reason, one of the many reasons why we have the president we currently have in the United States right now, is that the American public, rightly or wrongly, is no longer willing to bear these security guarantee burdens that they were willing to bear in a different era. And this is a problem we have to deal with. We have, in my view, we have to start re-engaging in this domestic debate before we're even capable of giving credible guarantees to our allies once again.
Let me just follow up on some of these issues as well. We've talked a lot about, just in the past couple of minutes about Russia, but we've also, and Olga mentioned this, Russia's economy is in the doldrums at this point. But does that actually weaken Russian military pressure on Ukraine? I mean, can Putin still have it both ways? In other words, can he still maintain a very weak economy while maintaining military pressure? At some point, something's going to give, but maybe I'm just being too naive. But if I could get your comments on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the Russian people are suffering enormously under sanctions, for example. But Vladimir Putin doesn't care as long as this doesn't threaten his hold on power. And he has ways that he's been developing quite effectively to get around sanctions in order to fund his military, not in order to fund a better life for Russian citizens, but to fund his military venture. And he believes, rightly or wrongly, that he can hold out, keep this going for longer than we in the Western public can tolerate. And that's a problem.
So for guns and butter, he can continue with the guns. Is that what you're saying?
In my view, yes. I mean, there are things that we could do, that we're bound to get into this part of the discussion later to turn up the economic pressure on Russia. For example, there is a live proposal for the Western powers to outright seize Russian central bank reserve assets. Over $300 billion in Russian central bank assets are effectively under European and US control. In my view, that's a very dangerous way to go for several reasons. First of all, it probably makes even the possibility of an armistice irrelevant. It's off the table. Russia would consider that almost an act of war. Secondly, there's no longer a basis for a compromise between Ukraine and Russia. Again, not to reach a peace treaty. I don't even think a peace treaty is possible, but an armistice. Ukraine has to have something to offer. If they take $300 billion of Russian reserves and spend it, that's gone. Why would they do it? Because they believe that they're under an effective US military umbrella. The second problem with outright seizure of Russian reserves is by any metric of both international law and US law, it's illegal. Okay, and others are watching what we're doing right now. China is watching what we're doing right now. Brazil is watching what we're doing now. And as we see, countries are beginning to diversify their foreign exchange reserves. First of all, what dollars they have, they're moving out of the United States. It used to be that if you held US Treasury securities, you just held them at the New York Fed. Then they were switched out to Belgium, to Euroclear. Now that the Europeans are cracking down, it's moving into even darker corners. So reserve assets are being moved out of US and European jurisdiction. They're being moved into other currencies, but in particular to gold. Stable coins are a way to elude capture, as it were. So the reverberation of outright seizure of Russian reserve assets would be enormous.
Yeah, so this is the deal I was talking about that could get finalized in April, just to be clear in terms of what we're talking about. Yeah, the concern across Europe, this is why it's taken so long to actually move this discussion this far, because the concern across Europe was, what kind of precedent are we sending by seizing these assets? And that was the worry. This is why we're over 3.5 years into this horrendous war. And this is why it hasn't happened yet, there's finally more consensus in Europe. And again, that comes from not necessarily because there isn't concern around the kind of precedent this sends, but because we're frankly running out of money. So this is where I think partially some of this emphasis comes from, is that, with US cutting off financial support and Europe, again, having its own economic struggles and challenges and competitiveness issues, when there is no money at the table, this looks like the best solution. And of course, there are issues, there are concerns on how this would change the reputation of investing in Europe. But at the same time, that's not a terrible precedent to put out there, that if you are going to go in and murder and rape and kidnap children and murder a bunch of civilians, that yes, your money may not be safe. So I don't think that's the worst precedent to put out there. And I think that should be a warning to other countries that think that they can commit some of the most horrendous crimes of this last couple of decades, including the last century, part of the chain of what Russia has done. And Stalin's buffer war wasn't a buffer war; it was a war of blood. It was people, millions and millions, being tortured, killed, sent to gulags. There's a reason why the Baltic states have a very strong reaction to Russian occupation, is because almost every single person that you talk to has a relative who was murdered, tortured, imprisoned. Russia has done something to them. So the fact that we're just casually talking about a buffer zone that sends millions into suffering is something that I'm not comfortable talking about. I don't think that's the world that we should try to think about creating. I don't think that that's what we should be striving for. And in terms of what we can do, in terms of the realities, it doesn't cost US any money, that doesn't cost us any troops, is we can't crack down on the sanctions and what's happening right now. Russia's biggest energy companies still have not been sanctioned, okay? Oil prices are dipping. So in terms of OPEC is willing to produce more. So this is a decent time to think through of what broader sanctions on Russia could look like. US sanctions, out of all of them, just to give you an example why US sanctions are important and why coordination is important. There are close to 700 shadow fleet ships that Russia bought up once there was a price cap, once Russia could not sell oil above a certain price. So what is Russia? So these ships could no longer use Western services, Western insurance, and other Western solutions as they were shipping oil around the world. So Russia went off and bought a bunch of really old, junky ships that are about to get scrapped. These old ships are out there floating around. And there's a disjointment in terms of a couple hundreds are sanctioned by US, a couple hundred by UK, a couple hundred by Europe. There is some overlap, but the US sanctions were the ones that when we take a look and we see what kind of immediate impact they had, the US sanctions are the ones that discouraged most of the ships after they were introduced, the biggest percentage of the ships to stop of the service companies and others supporting them. So there's a lot we can do. We can sanction the entire shadow fleet. We can sanction Russian energy companies. We can stop sending, we're still sending equipment. We can tighten our export controls. We're still sending equipment to Russia that makes it possible for them to develop their LNG. They can't do it. They can't figure out how to do LNG development, how to grow these projects, how to expand them without our technology, even things like pumps. These American companies are still sending that to Russia. Stopping that and just getting to the bottom of that doesn't cost us money. It doesn't cost an average American. This is not American troops on the ground. These are common sense solutions that will put the final pressure. And sanctions are always introduced as more of as a chess game. As soon as you introduce sanctions, you expect that there will be evasion. So you try to think about the next move. How do you make evasion costly? How do you make evasion complicated? And how do you distract? When Russia had to go off and buy these 700 or so shadow fleet, that's money that didn't go into bombing Ukrainian children. So I do think sanctions are not perfect. They need to be paired with a broader policy, but they are a super important tool in standing up to dictators.
Okay, Ben, did you want to comment? And then we'll open up for questions.
I think Olga's living in a fantasy world. I'm sorry to say it, but going back to the invasion in 2022, countries representing over 80% of the world's population disagreed with her and would not vote within the UN to sanction Russia. This is a problem. In 1947, again, the United States was at the apex of its power. It will never have that power again. Half the world's economy, sole possession of atomic weapons. And what did we decide to do? Build a buffer zone between us and the Soviet Union. And that's why we're sitting in this room today talking about the success of the Marshall Plan. So I have no disagreements with Olga on ethics. None whatsoever. I simply don't believe that this country is all powerful. And I certainly don't believe that the American public is going to support the types of commitments that Olga wants it to make. As for things like LNG, Donald Trump is all with you. He wants the Europeans to buy American natural gas, not Russian natural gas. The Europeans, despite this existential crisis that you say they're facing, don't seem to care. The Italians, the Hungarians, and others still want to buy this gas, and it's not just them. Are we going to ruin the beginnings of a repairing of the relationship between the US and India over India buying Russian oil? I don't know. Do we really want to do that? These are very difficult questions, and I'm not telling you that there are easy answers. I just want you to understand that we can't simply sit back and say that we can make these judgments purely on the basis of abstract ethics. At the end of the day, there has to be a coalition of countries willing and able to enforce resistance to Russia, and we have to decide how far we're willing to go in that regard.
Okay, it's very interesting, this back and forth, and I'm sure the audience will have some questions. So if you could please get behind the mic, and we'll take your questions, and please introduce yourself. And please make your comments as a question so they can answer the question. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dr. Elaine Soreo. I'm the Associate Rector of a private Ukrainian business university, and the only Ukrainian business university which is EU accredited. I specifically would like to draw attention to a topic that only ever so slightly gets touched on, and that is the over 20,000 children that Russia has kidnapped, refused to provide accountabilities for. And as yet, Ukraine, despite its work quietly in many ways behind the scenes, is being thwarted by Russia and their refusal to do it. Where do you see this fitting in? Because the Ukrainians want to have that addressed first as a precursor to anything, Marshall Plan, you name it, anything. They want the children. Thank you.
Thank you. Probably Olga, if you want to take.
Sure, I'll take that. I'd like to think that children is something that's a unifying topic, and I do think it's really hard to argue with, like, let's bring children back. I think it's important to understand how scary this lack of accountability. Part of those kids are being retrained, brainwashed, being made to watch ridiculous videos, and being made to believe that Russia is a savior, that Russia saved them from a horrible life in Ukraine. They tell them that their parents were terrible people, that they hate them. And there's different ages. And of course, and I've actually met an organization, and I'm happy to share their contact details after this panel with those of you who are interested. They physically go off and they risk their lives to go and return these kids. The work that they do is just so brave, and it's incredible. I actually had a chance to chat with some of these kids. Quite a few of them will travel to DC to share their stories to help people understand what's happening. But I think it again goes back to, like, having any kind of communication or agreements or negotiations with Putin. There is no master list. Some of those kids are being trafficked across the world. Some of those kids are gone, and it's beyond heartbreaking. So this is the kind of government, this is the kind of system that we're trying to have, an agreement with. So the kids should be something that everyone supports. This should be an initiative that everyone is pushing for. There's no political, it doesn't matter which way you're leaning or how you're seeing the Marshall Plan or the lack of it. This is something that everyone should be working towards. And I agree with you. I think it's a good place to start 3.5 years ago. But right now the urgency around it, because if you think about those kids who were kidnapped for a few years, they were in captivity, they were being brainwashed. That's the best case scenario. They're being trained to go fight their own people in Russia for 3.5 years now. So just think about that. So I thank you for bringing it up. I really appreciate the question.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Mitch Natali. I'm an undergraduate at American University doing international relations and economics. And I'm wondering, most of the discussion I've heard about the Marshall Plan focuses on the end of World War II. And I'm wondering if we're kind of comparing the wrong war to this. If you look post-World War II, most of the money for the Marshall Plan was set directing at rebuilding Germany, France, the UK. That's not really the problem the Ukraine has at the modern day right now. Despite the best efforts of Russia and especially Putin, most of Ukraine is not occupied. And most of the cost that is going to be associated is not that direct rebuilding, but the debt. And I'm wondering, why aren't we comparing it to kind of post-World War I, where, like, you see Germany, and the reason why the Weimar Republic collapsed was because of the balance of payments and the inability for them to pay their debt. And I'm wondering if maybe by taking some of that money, I think Ukraine is $100 billion in debt at the current moment. Could it be possible for the Russian, the $300 billion, 100 of that being taken and given to completely cover Ukraine debt? And instead of focusing on this, fighting of Russia, work on kind of building up Ukraine.
Thank you. Ben, I think it's yours.
Excellent question. Let's consider Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States spent more than 50% above and beyond the totality of the Marshall Plan investment, which was funneled over 16 countries, not just 2. So 50% more than the totality of Marshall aid in current dollars, just on reconstruction in Afghanistan and Iraq. What do we have to show for it? Nothing. Zero. In fact, in the case of Afghanistan, we literally just walked away. What went wrong? Security has to come first. Before the economic reconstruction and rehabilitation, you have to establish security. We weren't able to do that in either Iraq or Afghanistan, so our economic reconstruction aid was wasted. In the case of Germany, France, and the UK, it was much simpler. We were able to provide effective security guarantees. All of those countries either were, like the UK, or had been, like France and Germany, democracies. They all had a functioning, capable, relatively nonpartisan, impartial civil service that simply needed to be put back in operation, that was capable of overseeing competently and effectively and impartially a massive aid program. You don't have that in Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, Ukraine is in a similar situation. In my view, after an effective armistice is put in place, and after we see that it's capable of being enforced, then we can begin to talk seriously about major reconstruction efforts. But the security lever has to be pulled first.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, Luke Zonner, SIS grad, and I was most recently with the State Department working on the team of the Special Representative for Ukraine's economic recovery. And I traded an email with you earlier. We used your book actually on the Marshall Plan as a bit of a foundational work for some of the thinking that we were doing on Ukraine recovery, because so many people were talking about jumping straight to private investment, and you know, it was pretty evident, I think, pretty quickly when we stepped into the job that there were foundational issues in Ukraine, even with the war still going on, that could be focused on in order to try to kind of lay the foundations. And that's sort of, I want to kind of pivot away from the debate about how the war will end a little bit. I know it's obviously important, but we don't know. We have our hopes. My hopes are yours. My reality is more, sometimes I go back and forth. But the question I have is about the lessons of the Marshall Plan on actually how it worked, because there were 3 things that we were looking at, and I'm wondering if there are any lessons that we can take from that may be applicable in this case, despite the fact that we're talking about 16 countries helping one, or more than 16 countries helping one, rather than the inverse. The first is getting American audiences back here. I mean, a big element of that was public diplomacy back in the United States, to teach people about why it was still important to be in Europe. The second thing was about strategic planning. It wasn't so much about rebuilding Europe as it was getting them to plan strategically, and that a big factor of that was integrating the economies. And then the third thing is capacity, which I don't know how applicable that necessarily is to Marshall Plan lessons to Ukraine. But one of the big problems Ukraine has is a lack of capacity in its government right now. They don't have the people to do this, and it's going to have to come from somewhere. Training is going to take a while. And I'm just wondering how the Marshall Plan dealt with that issue after World War II as well.
Maybe Ben and then Olga, if you want to chime in on this.
These are really good questions. With regard to public diplomacy, there was a massive public diplomacy initiative before the Marshall Plan was legislated. In fact, some in the State Department referred to it as a Marshall Plan to pass the Marshall Plan. General Marshall himself traveled all around the country, meeting with labor groups, with religious groups, trying to convince women, for example, that they could contribute to the campaign by growing the equivalent of victory gardens, et cetera, to engage the American public and convince them that this was something in their interest, that we weren't just playing Santa Claus, as Dean Acheson had put it. Republican congressmen made trips to Europe to see for themselves what the situation was. This was very important for the Truman administration. It was faced with a Republican Congress that wanted a peace dividend, that didn't want a massive new foreign aid program. But these congressmen came back from Europe convinced that the situation was dire and that they could, in fact, do something about it. So public diplomacy, exceptionally important. I don't know if we have the capacity or indeed the willingness to do it today, but I think it would be absolutely necessary. In terms of the capacity within the country itself, this is another difficult issue. I never want you to think that these issues are difficult, or easy. How did we deal with it in Germany? We decided to let denazification go. It was a huge debate within the State Department and the Treasury about the morality of abandoning the denazification program. Unfortunately, too many Germans with expertise had been Nazis or close to the Nazis, and these were the only ones who knew how to run the country on a day-to-day basis. So we made some difficult moral compromises, but this capacity question is real and it's important. Third thing I wanted to emphasize, and perhaps I should have talked about it at the outset, we didn't just write Europe checks. It was actually a quite complex program to ensure that there were market forces operating, and that this was not out of ideological reasons. I mean, President Truman was not a big follower of Friedrich Hayek, for example, but we wanted to make sure that this money was being directed to things that Europeans really needed. So how did the Marshall Plan funding actually work? It was built around the concept called counterpart funds. So let's say a French farmer needed a tractor. He couldn't buy one in France because the country was devastated. But he could buy an American tractor if it was available to him. He couldn't pay in dollars. So what would happen? The French farmer would buy an American tractor in French francs. It would send the French francs to the French central bank, which operated a fund where this money was accumulated. For every franc that was put into the fund, the French government was required to put in another franc. Then the French government was invited to decide how to spend the money for industrial modernization, for fiscal stabilization, et cetera. And at the end of the day, the United States had veto power over it. They almost never exercised it. They tried to exercise it, but each time they did, the French government would just simply say, we're going to collapse if you do this. So if you don't want the communists back into the coalition government, you better let us do what we want. And that was a very effective argument. And then the U.S. government would pay an American tractor manufacturer to ship a tractor to the French farmer. So the French farmer got what he wanted. The French government got its industrial modernization plan, but there was no negative effect on the French balance of payments. No dollars were transmitted. So this was a very clever means to make sure that the money was well spent. Now, there's got to be a modern counterpart funds. You wouldn't want to replicate a model like this precisely in Ukraine, but I think you'd want to make sure that the same principles were at play, that the money was really being directed to the most pressing needs in terms of regenerating Ukraine's productive capacity.
Okay, thank you. Olga, could you address the issue of capacity within the Ukraine?
Yeah, and I'll keep it really short because I want to make sure we get to all of the questions. I love this lineup. I just wanted to share one really innovative example. Ukraine right now is looking into ways on how to get people who are not working for whatever reason. Maybe they were displaced, maybe they were working in an industry that when they had to move to be safe, they could no longer have access to that industry. So there are actually quite a few people in Ukraine that are not working at the moment, not because they don't want to, but for a lot of different reasons. Another thing that could be done today, not 5, 10, however many years from now. So people need good housing in order to attract people to work, even in a war zone. Good housing, and frankly, the best thing you could do to rebuild capacity is to really secure the sky, have sufficient weapons to protect Ukrainians from being bombed, because that will actually, if people feel safer, they're more likely to stay or not leave the country. They're more likely to come back. There's a huge community out there that really wants to go back and be a part of the rebuilding process, be a part of the new post-war Ukraine. But again, that community needs opportunities. They need a decent salary. And right now, if you're working for a Ukrainian government, it is not a market, it's not it's the reality. It's very unfortunate. It's not a competitive salary. So this is how you build capacity. These are the market mechanisms to attract the brightest minds and to bring people back home, because a lot of the Ukrainians that I talked to, a lot of the diaspora communities, they really, really miss home, and they cannot wait to go back, and they want to be part of the rebuilding process.
Okay, thank you. We have about 20 minutes left, so if you keep your questions brief, appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks for the great discussion. I'm Lucas, a grad student here at SAS. So my question is, due to the limited financial support to Ukraine, how can we lower barriers of trade between Ukraine and the European Union to give them options to raise revenue from trade and get that vital foreign currency? Could you both speak to that issue, which is a regulatory issue in the European Union?
Yes.
So if you could each give brief remarks, thank you.
Could I start? In terms of what's needed versus what's kind of, looks nice on a map or looks nice in a report. I think there's this narrative that, and this assumption that Ukraine, as soon as peace is reached, Ukraine is going to be this powerhouse of energy production and, sending off energy supplies all across Europe and producing this and that and critical minerals. But the reality of it is that it does need to be a market driven. It does need to be products that align with what the European Union and the global markets need. And you'll be surprised that these conversations are already happening in Ukraine on how to not compete with whether it's agricultural exports or other exports, but to really complement where the gaps are. This is why the critical minerals discussion is so exciting, because it does complement, does address a huge gap we have, not just in Europe, but in the West, in the United States. China has fully overtaken, and Ukraine is not going to solve all of those problems. That's not realistic. But if it could be a part of the solution, and we need to be realistic about what does that take. These critical mineral projects, they're billions of dollars worth of investments. So that's not something small or tiny that can start tomorrow. Those projects, they take years of research, making sure that you're looking at updated maps. And even if the Ukrainian government was to do an updated assessment of where the critical minerals are, how do you access them? Most companies, most private sector, they want to do their own. They want to come in and they want to do their own assessment. So I would say this is an opportunity to kind of think through and have that study. If you are a company that's looking into Ukraine, this is a good time to do that preliminary assessment and figure out what makes sense. But it has to be market-driven signals, whether it's energy, whether it's biofuels, whether it's even natural gas development. Ukraine has tremendous capacity for natural gas, additional natural gas, and also natural gas storage too that could serve as a creative mechanism. But there has to be a demand signal, and it can't be something that we just wish for Ukraine to export. There has to be a market for it, and we have to be realistic about it.
Thank you. Ben, give you briefly.
The extent that Ukraine can extract natural gas efficiently, there's a natural market in Europe. So that's a perfect fit. Agriculture, however, is far from a perfect fit. As you know, France, Poland, they do not want competition from Ukraine. So as much solidarity as they want to show rhetorically, when it comes to actual negotiations of a trade agreement, agriculture is going to be a major sticking point.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please.
Hello. First of all, thank you. I'm a SIS grad student studying U.S. foreign policy and national security, so this is very integral to my studies. To that note, I wanted to ask the role that the EU should play perhaps as a primary actor in terms of rebuilding Ukraine, while the United States maybe provides security guarantees and secondary forms. I know that you mentioned the Korean example. As we know, there's North Korean troops entering Russia. So I guess it's kind of a question of as to how the United States and the EU can cooperate in separate areas to bring about a strategy that y'all kind of seem to disagree upon, but I believe can actually be permeable, right? European financial support and US security working not necessarily in the same area per se, but in different sectors.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Kind of a division of labor, I guess the question is trying to get to. Thank you. Olga?
I think when it comes to dividing how the support is provided, there has to be, to your point, there has to be appetite on US in terms of what is US willing to do. And there's, that has kind of evolved even over the last 9 to 10 months. I feel like that conversation has very much evolved. I think there is consensus generally around the United States that kind of this really not wanting to have troops on the ground in a hot conflict. There could be, with the right vision and kind of the right messaging, perhaps there could be, we've also seen different statements from President Trump on what that could look like. If it's not a hot zone, if it's not a hot conflict, if it's just enforcing peace, is there going to be, but it has to be supported by the American public, right? There has to be broader support. So yes, there's all sorts of tools and ways that you can defend. But I think, going back to, not to berate our issue, but going back to, given Putin, whether it's East Ukraine or Crimea, but then not properly defending the rest of Ukraine, you're just basically delaying him overtaking the whole country without proper security guarantees, whether they come from Europe, whether they come from the United States. The reality is, if you give up parts of Ukraine without properly defending the rest, you're just handing him over Ukraine on the platter.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Trey Hendricks. I'm a second-year grad student. I used to work and live in Ukraine, so this conflict is personal to me. Although this question is mainly for you. So when we talk about a new Marshall Plan, how do we make sure it doesn't just pour money into Kyiv and Lviv, but also actually rebuild like frontline cities like Kharkiv, Dnipro, Mykolaiv, and parts of Kherson that has faced the brunt of the Russian occupation?
I love this
Thank you.
question. Yeah, I love this question because I think, I love these cities, and these cities are beautiful and historic in different areas. But at the same time, you're right. I think sometimes we take it for granted, thinking that all aid or all engagement would just automatically, equally will be spread across the country. So you do have to be thoughtful. But because I know energy, again, I'm going to use the Ukrenergo example as the skeleton here. So you have a centralized energy system that's interconnects the entire country, originally built around one massive power plant and kind of sending off energy all across. Now, already today, smaller cities, smaller communities, from villages to small cities on the outskirts of these big metropolitan areas, they're already kind of doing their own thing just to building out these these mini grids. So in this case, it's about finding a balance. How do you take the ideas of what the cities, what the communities need, with interconnectivity, with the flow, because the last thing you also want is to have a bunch of mini communities that are not properly interconnected via transport, via roads, digitally, disconnected, and that that their energy systems are so poorly integrated that you're constantly having issues with the grid. So I think this is where the fine balance is. It's impressive to see, if you travel across Ukraine for this in some of the cities, the level of preparation, how clearly some mayors, and when they come and visit here and they talk about a vision for their city, how well they can. But the sad reality is it's not the same all across. A lot of these communities, going back to the capacity questions, do not have that capacity to even think about, this is what our dreams, this is what, where our city, these are the resources and the talents, and, our city had this factory, how do we restart it? How do we use it as an economic growth? Most cities right now are capacity strapped, and they don't really have even the opportunity to think, to build that decentralized vision out. So it's marrying the two, right?
Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you for the panel discussion. I was really learning a lot. I'm also from the AU grad school here, and I'm doing a NATO practicum with a NATO officer. We were really focusing on lessons that NATO can learn from Ukraine. And I think it's really for the research purpose and, for submitting my assignments. If there is an entity I could track that says I can know all the sources of energy that are currently provided in Ukraine, and if there's such entity that I can track it, and also for the future purposes, I can keep an eye on them. Just which organization should I seek out? And
Yes, so obviously follow Planning Council, but no, jokes aside, one of the best nonprofits in Ukraine, and they finally are working closely officially with the Ukrainian Energy Ministry, is called Dixie Group. I trust those people. I know them personally. All of their reports, it's hard numbers, hard reporting. They do weekly digest. Like right now, if you were to sign up for the Dixie Group, if you were to sign up for the letter, they will tell you, okay, Russia destroyed this many power plants with this capacity down going into this winter. This is how many things have been rebuilt. So they're my favorites. I will vouch on their data. And Kyiv School of Economics, oh, incredible, incredible people. They do amazing research in the midst of, like, while being bombed, like they go in and they keep working in the basement, producing reports, producing graphs. Kyiv School of Economics and Dixie Group. So good luck to you.
could you spell that for me? I have international students.
It's DIXI Group.
Thank you.
Good question.
Next question, thank you.
Hi, my name is Lily Bias. I'm a freshman here at AU, and my question is, do you think any sort of American intervention prior to a peace treaty or an armistice would lead to a situation like the one we left in Afghanistan? And if so, how could we avoid that?
Ben, do you want to take that?
And realistically, I can't see any sort of American military commitment in Ukraine prior to there being at least a clear working armistice. Even at that point, I think it would be difficult. What President Trump has suggested, which I think is actually reasonably clever, is to have American commercial projects beginning to be established in Ukraine under the premise that the Russians would be careful about killing Americans as long as the armistice seemed to be working in accordance with what they consider to be their fundamental interests, which obviously shifts to the left and the right over time as they make progress or they lose territory in Ukraine. So I don't really foresee a U.S. military presence as being realistic, but a commercial presence might actually serve the same purposes in a guise that the American public could more easily digest.
Thank you. Next question, please.
Hi, so I'm a freshman, and my entire life, Vladimir Putin has led Russia. And so you touched on very briefly about like how he's like an obstacle to peace, and whether or not he's a rational or irrational player, he is an unfriendly actor on the global stage. And so my question is, he's old. Hopefully he dies soon. Hopefully. I know that may be wrong to say, but how do we know that Russian foreign policy will change towards Ukraine after? He's not the first leader to commit a genocide in Ukraine, and hopefully he's the last, but how do we know he will be? So my question is, how do you think it will change after Putin dies?
Maybe each of you could take a stab at that briefly.
Yeah, I think there's a zero chance of a Yeltsin-type government coming back into power. There's no stomach for that in Russia. So it's not going to be a pro-Western government as we might have hoped for way back before you were born in the 1990s. Having said that, Russia does have a lot of problems right now, a lot of economic problems. And to my mind, the best way for any new Russian government, even a nationalist one, is to establish credibility with the public after all these years of one-person rule, would be to show the public that there is a better life available. And that would probably mean some sort of outreach to the West to show the Russian public that there is the prospect of a future in which conflict can be ratcheted down. I don't think we can expect more of that, more from that. I mean, there's no going back to the 1990s, in my view. But almost anything that could, Olga might disagree with me, almost anything that could reasonably emerge in Russia after Putin, in my view, would be an improvement to Putin.
Okay, Olga, go ahead.
I know we're running out of time. So we're fighting a system here, right? Not just Putin. Putin is just kind of at the very kind of top of that system. So the system doesn't automatically go away after one man dies. And these people around him who have benefited, who have been given all sorts of Western factories as gifts for their legion and all sorts of rewards for their atrocities and their loyalty, these people will still be around. However, there is, I do think it's important to take a look at this one scenario where, yes, Putin goes away and then a new government is in charge and they post themselves as, oh, we're pro-Western. We are a changed nation. We've learned our lesson. Oh my goodness, I cannot believe these other guys did all of these horrible things. This is unbelievable. But yeah, we really want to integrate with the West. We really miss, being included fully in Olympics and in Eurovision. So we just cannot wait to get back to that. And I do think that there is going to be appetite in Europe to just fully believe that, let your guards down. And I think that there needs to be kind of a medium where you still have, you don't automatically go back and fix Nord Stream 2 just because there's a new government in town and just automatically assume that this new government is genuine, that they're not going to use energy for coercion and use energy to blackmail Europe. Again, this is just one example of how this could be played in terms of, setting this up as, oh, we're completely changing your government, give us another chance, please buy our gas, please, go back to dependency on other sources, and, then they go back and they take the rest of Ukraine.
Let me just add one thing, if I may. As we all know, Khrushchev ascended to Soviet power in the 50s, and he pursued what's called de-Stalinization, but he was the same guy that led the brutal repression of Hungary in 56. So even though there could be some changes, sometimes it's not very dramatic, but that's my 2 cents worth. Next question, please.
Yeah, my question is building off what Mr. Steele said about France and Poland opposing competition for a redeveloped Ukrainian agricultural sector. Would there likely be pushback to a Marshall Aid program from Eastern European states like Poland, Slovakia, or Hungary that could maybe see a redeveloped Ukraine as a economic competitor to them? And what steps could be taken within a Marshall Plan like this to prevent that?
Would you like to?
Sure. It goes back to my comment on how do you complement what's actually needed? How do you pay attention to the market forces? And on products that are directly competing with Europe, how do you access the global market easier? I think this is a good kind of middle ground in terms of, because there is still global demand for Ukraine's wheat and other things that potentially could be seen as competition. But this also needs to be done in parallel with fixing European agricultural policy. I will tell you that, yes, the exports from Ukraine created a lot of tension and a lot of uncomfortable moments at a time where, Ukraine has received tremendous support from Poland, from other neighbors. At the same time, Europe has had these agricultural problems in its policy, in the way that its agriculture is managed, in the way things are incentivized, in the structure that it has existed long before Ukraine came in with its exports. So I think fixing those two things in parallel, paying attention to what's needed in the global market, meeting those needs, and then figuring out how to then, whatever needs to be rerouted from Europe to global markets like Asia and Africa and across the world, where it's actually wanted and needed and not seen as a competition, is going to be really, really important. That's where infrastructure comes in. That's where rebuilding infrastructure, ports, and so on will be very, very important.
Just add that there's a Russia dimension here too. If you go back to the EU Association Agreement, what year was that? Around 2014 or so? Yeah. That was one of the issues that triggered the higher level conflict between Russia and the EU over Ukraine. So Ukraine wanted to become more integrated with the EU economy. The Russian response was, well, hold it. We have economic agreements with them, and some of the provisions that you're talking about are actually violations of agreements that we have already reached with Ukraine. We need to talk about this. And the attitude in the EU, which was made very clear by Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, is that, you know, we asked you permission for decades during the Cold War, but we're not willing to do that now. And that was a nice, firm, principled position to take in the abstract. But when you have very little leverage on the ground, it's a difficult position to enforce. So I just want to be clear that when it comes to economics, it's not as if Russia is going to allow Ukraine a free lane. They're going to have something to say about the nature of those agreements as well, whether we like it or not.
Okay, and one final question. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, so I just have a question about, you know, the Potsdam Conference was held at the end of World War II to set up the boundaries for, say, East Germany and West Germany. You know, there's been a lot of talk about more Russia taking these as provinces rather than it becoming a separate state, like in East Ukraine. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that and what that means for, it's about the population of Maryland that exists in Ukraine, the eastern part of Ukraine, the Donbass combined with Crimea. So it's about 6 million people. It's actually about twice the size of Maryland. This is a big piece of land. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about that kind of that thing that's coming hopefully sooner rather than later, and whether you think there will be a stand-up and whether we should really press for a stand-up of this separate identity place where the Russians would say that they're liberating these people, right? You know, millions of people that live in East Donbass that were discriminated against, and that's their rationale for this whole war, right? So that's a little bit different than, like, you know, East Germany, right? So, I mean, they have a perspective, and how do we respect that and have the best solution when there is an end to this crisis?
That's a line the Russians are going to take irrespective of what we do, and I certainly don't think we should in any way help them. Let them try to create that narrative if they want. It's going to be a very challenging one for them. Again, I think the most we should agree to is an armistice where we recognize conditions for a cessation of hostilities, but that's it. In no way should we legally recognize any Russian annexation, including of Crimea. And that's acknowledging that it's highly, highly unlikely to go back to Ukraine at any point in the foreseeable future. But it's very important in terms of global diplomacy that we not accord any legitimacy to this type of annexation. Just to be clear about Potsdam and Yalta, there was never any discussion between the US and the Soviet Union about splitting Germany. But between the two, both sides wanted at that time to maintain a unified Germany, but one wanted it to be democratic and capitalist, and one wanted it to be authoritarian and communist. It was the US that, as you know, in 49 moved first and created its own West German state. That's in May of 1949. And then the Soviets followed shortly behind in October of 49. But that was never done on a coordinated basis.
Olga, do you want to add something?
Ultimately, it will be up to the Ukrainian government to decide on where those lines end up. But again, going back to our question on how twofold, how do you protect the rest of Ukraine, even if there is an agreement on some kind of a line? And again, that needs to be up to the Ukrainian people. If there is some kind of an agreement, and who makes sure that the things that Russians do in these territories, the kind of crimes that they commit quietly or not quietly. I'll give you one example. Religious persecution in occupied territories in the East, for example, massive problem. Jewish communities, Catholics, any entity, any priest, any religious figure that's not Russian Orthodox, they've been sent to camps, and that's best case scenario. A lot of times they're tortured, they're murdered. So are teachers, because they find teaching and Ukrainian culture like is such a threat to the narrative. So I think it's twofold. I think it's how do you protect, how do you secure the rest of the country, and then how do you keep an eye on what is happening within these territories, because a lot of what they've also done in like Crimea is literally push out native populations. Like in Crimea, it's Tatars who fled because they were afraid for their lives and left their homes behind, who are now illegally occupied by Russian families. So I think there's going to be a wave of that as well for any buildings that are still standing up, not too many, unfortunately, around some of these areas. But these are the questions that we should be asking, and we should have a clear system on how to make sure that those atrocities don't continue under, just because they're not happening on TV or they're happening in a way where the world kind of doesn't see them every day. They're happening more quietly.
Well, thank you. We've run out of time, but I think it was a very stimulating discussion. I want to thank our two distinguished panelists, and thank you, the audience.